Thank you, Ms. Campbell-Williams. Our next speaker is Dr. Robert Keith Collins. Dr. Collins is of African and Choctaw descent. He is a curator of the Indivisible exhibition and a professor at San Francisco State University. His presentation is titled "The Dynamics of Common Unity Between Africans and Native Americans, Evidence from African Native American Narratives." Dr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Gover. Himaknetakatakili hoke, halito ash. In the language of my grandmother and my mother, that means today's a really good day. And how y'all doing? So, the talk today is on the dynamics of common unity between Africans and Native Americans, and particularly what I hope that all of you will do is think about what I'm saying only. Take the good, as my Laguna aunt says, and stick it in your pocket. And then the bad stuff, just toss it out. Bathwater, baby, maybe. Just kidding. So, let's begin. Quote, "The general combination of legal status and physical fact has given us a unique situation in the United States. There are a number of persons legally classified as Indian who have far more Negro blood than they have Indian blood. A few of these groups live on reservations legally provided for Indians. A number of these are not even Indians from the point of view of cultural anthropology. In other cases, there are Indians who are greatly mixed with Negroes, who are Indians in their culture and are legally regarded as Indians. In other instances, large numbers of persons who are mixed with Negro and Indian blood accept the status of Negroes because of the fact that their dominant culture is Negro. Yet in these instances, these persons often take delight in telling about their Indian strain." End quote. How dynamic were the communities in which Africans and Native Americans lived together? To engage this question, this presentation examines the nature and origins of alliances and allegiances forged between Africans and Native Americans within Native American communities, as discernible from WPA slave narratives and the American ethnographic record. By African Native American, I am referring to individuals of blended racial and/or cultural African and Native American ancestry. In the aforementioned quote from Lawrence Foster, he reminds us that the communities in which Africans and Native Americans coexisted must be understood as a result of the various interpersonal interactions, both individually and collectively, that created common unity, either forced or voluntary, between these two resilient peoples over time, and the meanings that these bonds held in the lives of the people and their descendants. This presentation encourages listeners to question their racial expectations as well as the cultural expectations, if such expectations suggest that one can know the totality of a person's parentage and lived realities merely from skin color. While this point may seem like common sense, it runs contrary to American race-making practices and racial expectations, which tend to reduce understandings of self within U.S. society to the recognition parameters of racial categories. In contrast to these practices, the ethnographic information presented to you today will illustrate how, on the one hand, some communities in which Africans and Native Americans coexisted were forged through common purpose, trust, mutual respect, adoption, and love, but on the other, that forced servitude and exploitation consistent with historical American cultural practices towards individuals of African descent, shape the social conditions and customs of others. Acknowledging that these communities existed, as accomplished through the Indivisible exhibit, is only a foundation for this incredible area of research. There remains the challenge of further investigation into the motivational forces behind the creation, maintenance, and even forgetting of these communities, and why some individuals of African descent were included while others were excluded. To engage this question now is to add another dimension to changing trends in ethnographic analyses, both in anthropology and American Indian studies, on African and Native American interaction. No longer is it sufficient to only approach the subject from the perspectives of Native Americans and African Native Americans that asserted Native American understandings of self. Instead, inclusion of the narrated lived realities of African Native Americans that lived as African Americans, and the conflict of ambiguous definition of being and belonging they have struggled against is vital to a comprehensive understanding of the dynamic communities of tolerance and acceptance Native Americans created. This focus is central in this presentation because it revitalizes earlier works which are often frequently forgotten by the American public, particularly that of the first African-American historians such as Carter G. Woodson and J. Hugh Johnson, their works respectively, The Relations of Negroes and Indians in Massachusetts, and Documentary Evidence of Relations of Negroes and Indians, as well as the first African-American and African Native American cultural anthropologists, a line which I follow in, such as Carolyn Bonday, Race Crossing in the United States, and Lawrence Foster's Negro-Indian Relations in the Southeast, as well as the work that many of you have read by Zora Neale Hurston, most of whom do not think about, for example, her Native American grandparentage. And because this information is grounded also, and most significantly, in irrefutable ethnographic data that shows how race was not a master programmer of all African and Native American interactions, the way that we enter numbers into our cellular devices. The narratives to be discussed here will offer not the exhaustive political theory and jargon found in many academic discussions, which I indeed love. However, they're going to show you the remembered realities presented, for example, through these narratives, in which individuals talk about the lives that they lived, the integral roles they played within communities. And their words should hopefully urge us, academic, amateur scholar, and heritage searcher alike, to find missing stories, explanations that can explain the knowledge and expand the knowledge on the unified African and Native American efforts that created the range of communities that their descendants reflect. What is community? By subjective definition, community is the common unity among a social group that resides in the same locale, shares government, and a common cultural and historical past and heritage. Ethnographic investigations and observations of Native American communities with residents of African descent have illuminated a diversity of living conditions and social pressures and attitudes as far as their presence is concerned. In 1882, Jedediah Morse observed, for the purpose of creating a report to the Secretary of War on Indian Affairs, Africans intermingling fluidly with Montauk's, Mastics, Pupatucks, and Shinnecocks of Long Island, and with equal frequency and fluidity among the Narragansett. It was also noted that the people made no distinction between half-breed and pure-blood children, and all were loved by the people equally. Cyrus Thomas noted in 1903 that the Narragansett pureblood had vanished and that many communities could easily be mistaken for Negro communities. Alman Lauber's 1913 study of Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States offered documentary proof that the general attitudes of whites, as evident in their customs and laws, regulated the lives of both Indians and Negroes and often lumped them in the same category. Frank Speck's 1915 observations of this practice could possibly explain why he noted that the Neantique made racial hierarchies salient to their understandings of self and tribal composition. Quote, in Delaware, a group of people call themselves Moor Indians, or Natticokes. This group, for the most part, forms a community self-recognized as distinct from the rest of the population of the state. Physically, the members are of a very much mixed European, Indian, and Negro blood. Prior to the days of Reconstruction, the Moors were included in the population of colored people, although they were not held as slaves. In the latter years, the state of Delaware gave them the status of Negroes and provided schools and made public provisions for them along with the Negro population. Many of them resisted this, and finally, through one of their energetic men, were able to get a different status and are now considered Indians. However, the group that lived at Cheswold, Kent County, Delaware, has a number of persons who desire to be called, not to be called Indians, and who intermarry with Negroes quite frequently. Today, there are a number of them attending Delaware State College for Negroes. The difference in attitude towards Negroes has given rise, consequently, to two different bands. Those who are Indians and refuse to mix with Negroes call themselves the Indian River or Warwick Indian community. It is these persons who, from the Natticoke Indian Association, is formed. The other group are gradually losing their identity. They intermarry frequently with light-skinned Negroes who have influential positions in community. These form what is known today as the Harmonia people, end quote. Elsie Parsons' folklore studies revealed how the Cherokee had a strain of Negro blood, although it was frequently denied, which made the Negro blood part of being Cherokee. In a similar vein, the Croatans of Robeson County were persons of blended white, Negro, and Indian ancestry that often refused to accept the status of Negro. Consequently, their schools, businesses, etc., were often established independently, and they did not associate with Negroes. Swanton's research documented how Africans had assimilated into many of the Indian cultures of Louisiana, Choctaw, Chitimacha, Homa, etc., and that it was often these individuals of blended ancestries that were the only speakers of their tribal languages and maintainers of communal ties. Lawrence Foster's observation suggests that this diversity in demographics and racial attitudes towards individuals of African descent could be attributed to the fact that the, quote, amount of opposition which the Negro meets from the Indian in any given locality varies directly with the strength and persistence of the race complex in that locality. The whole attitude of the Indian in this respect is worthy of attention. In most instances, the attitude is definitely traceable to the fact that the Indian has learned that his association with the Negro gives him the status of a Negro, which status is generally a damning one, both in the estimation of the man who gives the status and of the man to whom it applies, end quote. He further states that, quote, his thoughts are either in anticipation of or in consequence of the race complex, and consequently the race complex takes up entirely too much time of both groups, end quote. Cersei Sturm's pioneering ethnography, Blood Politics, Race, Culture, and Identity in the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma revealed how this race complex affected enrollment procedures. A respondent described an incident in the enrollment experience of a Cherokee woman whose minimal African ancestry was enough to consign her to the freedmen rolls rather than the rolls for Cherokee by blood. Quote, when she went to the Citizenship Commission to enroll, they looked at her face and they saw a Cherokee woman and said, through whom do you claim? You know, what are your parents' names? What is your degree of Indian blood? They put it all down, and then someone comes in and says, she ain't no Cherokee, she's a nigger. That woman is a nigger, and you're going to put her down as a nigger. So the Dawes Commission has to go back and research her family and get all the documentation and tell this poor woman that not only are you going to be on the freedmen rolls, but also so are your children, end quote. The great variation in Native American attitudes towards individuals of African descent revealed in these analyses not only offer a window into the complexities of Native American communities in the face of colonization and population changes in culture and phenotype, but also the lack of uniformity in Native American adoptions of American racial attitudes within their communities. Problems in the analysis of Africans within Native American communities. While this topic is well supported by a small, empirically sound body of literature, there were several explanatory gaps encountered in the analysis of individuals of African descent within Native communities, especially when working on this exhibit. One, it is difficult to ascertain to which the narratives found in the anthropological record are reflective of the breadth of experiences that these communities would have produced. The majority of narratives discuss kinship bonds with Native Americans, alliances and allegiances to tribal factions based on loyalty to particular Native American families. For example, Ms. Cheney Richardson told the following to WPA field worker Ether Rolfe Garrison in October 1937, quote, my master and all the rest of the folks was Cherokee. They've been killing each other off in a feud ever since long before I was born. Just because old master have a big farm and 3 families of Negroes, there are other Cherokees kept pestering his stuff all the time. Us children was always afeard to go places less than some of the grown folks was along. When I was about 10 years old, that feud got so bad, the Indians were once always talking about getting their horses and cattle killed and their slaves harmed. I was too little to know how bad it was until one morning, my own mammy went off somewhere down the road to get some stuff to dye the cloth, and she didn't come back. Lots of the young Indian bucks on both sides of the feud rode out and around the woods at night, and old master got powerful uneasy about Mammy and had all the neighbors and slaves looking out for her, but nobody find her.